All right, hello everybody. I guess we're live now. Cool. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Peter McConnell. I'd like to thank Damien and Scott for inviting me to speak. I've been writing music for games now for about 25 years. So I guess that's why I was invited to speak about this subject, which is what can we learn from the classic era of game music. The classics, we hear a lot about them these days. And we remember some of these titles fondly. Oh, by the way, I didn't talk about what I've actually done, I guess. Well, I worked for LUCASARTS for a bunch of years. And after that, I scored, in LUCASARTS, I scored games like, or helped to score games like Monkey Island 2, Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis, Grim Fandango, Full Throttle. After that, Psychonauts, Sly Cooper series, Broken Age, the Kickstarter from Double Fine, and Hearthstone for Blizzard Entertainment. So I've been lucky to be doing this for a while, and I do have, I guess you might say, some kind of a perspective on all this that extends for more time than I'd care to admit. So, King's Quest, Wing Commander, Seventh Guest, Myst. Does anybody remember these games? I mean, they were pretty cool, and it was an exciting time because it was a really new industry. And by the way, does anybody know who this guy is over here? Oh, come on. Okay, he announced the longest running TV commercial in the history of television for the Columbia Collection of Classics, classical music. Remember, even you can own the Polvetzian Dances by Borodin. And his name, for extra credit, anybody know his name? He was Mr. French in Family Affair for one time. John Williams. And speaking of John Williams, my experience in this business started working for a company owned by George Lucas, and not really this George Lucas, I think, but more like this George Lucas. And as I said, we did some titles that I'm still very fond of and proud of in those days. And it was a really interesting time to be in the business, and I think it's worth, if you want to think about now, because I do hear a lot of people talk about, oh, the golden age of games. They just don't make them like they used to. When you had to only work with 8 bits, my goodness, you had to write a good tune, and now it's all about the production, right? I'm sure you've heard stuff like this before. And there's a grain of truth to some of that, but I think there's also a healthy amount of salt to throw over your shoulder when you hear that kind of stuff. And but it is worth remembering what it was like, because some of it is amazingly like now. So in those days, games and virtual reality, I don't know if you remember virtual reality, but it was sort of like games, only more exciting sounding. They were a niche software market, right? It was nerd culture. It was a very, very, very few, kind of, in a way, elite group of people who were into it. And, I did not go to the first GDC, but I did go to the second one. And the second GDC had about 250 people at it. And it was at some hotel in San Jose. And 50 of them were us folks from LUCASARTS, which that was about the size of the company then. And we all wore these little red fezzes, like Morocco mole. Guys, anybody know Secret Squirrel? All right. Jeez. Maybe there's at least one other baby boomer in here. So we all wore these fezzes, and that had the LucasArts logo on them. And it was just kind of a way of saying, we're pretty wacky, and we're all kind of in this cool little team, and we all worked together. And we'd actually go to company meetings. George Lucas would be on stage, and there'd be ILM over here, and over here there would be Skywalker Sound, and over here would be LUCASARTS with their red fezzes on, and no one really knew what to make of us. But it was all kind of a reflection of where games were in the big picture at the time. They were something that was about to happen. They were not something that had really happened yet. And space, in those days, I'm supposed to have a big picture of a floppy disk here, but you can't find floppy disks anymore. We shipped the Monkey games and Indy and so forth on floppies. And if you can imagine that, when we worked on our new sound system, the fact that it took an entire floppy disk was this horrible, horrible thing. We had to really, just advocate for our new sound system intensely because of the what was at the time a huge space hog, right? But anyway, CD-ROMs came along and changed everything. They promised vast amounts of storage. There were lots of claims about how much data you were going to be able to get on one, which sort of turned out to be overblown. But they still changed the industry tremendously. And audio hardware, the Sound Blaster just being invented, right? Basically, the state of the art was 2D, 2.5D, kind of like that picture you first saw from Monkey Island 2. And 3D was the future. Wolfenstein came out, and it was a game changer, as it were. Talkies, we actually called them talkies, were a novelty, right? And we were doing the voices ourselves. Yoda was, right? And so it was very in-house. We tended to be small as a whole. And Lucas is not exactly maybe reflective of the entire industry in some ways, but in others it very much was. Small group of very young people sort of getting together and inventing things from their bootstraps. And what this meant was, first of all, budgets were tiny. We went lo-fi because we had to. I mean, if we'd have had surround sound to work with, we would have worked with surround sound. But what we had was 8-bit audio cards, and even worse, the PC speaker. Necessity, therefore, was the mother of invention, right? And we wore many hats, right? I was hired to help design and program the interactive music system at LUCASARTS, as well as to write music for it. And that was, it was very common in those days, unfortunately in some cases, but for people to wear, many hats, from being, programmer to tester to voice actor. And we were in-house, and this is one of those things where it's not so true now for some of us, but it's very true for others of us. We were in-house, so we had time. We had time to come up with stuff. And George Lucas actually sort of explicitly went to the board and said, of LucasArts, I don't care what you do for this amount of time, just do cool stuff. And that was kind of an ideal job to have, where someone was telling you, hey, I don't care what you do, just do cool stuff. By the way, that changed. So one of the things that we did with all this time was, hey, let's make an interactive music system. Let's do cool stuff, right? So the challenge in those days was to basically leap out of a really crappy little speaker and get people's attention and satisfy a really picky cadre of nerds. And I got into games because I loved Zork. Does anybody remember Zork? Okay. Those MIT geeks who then became Infocom. And anyway, a whole different deal now. Now, we've grown up as an industry. We're now officially entertainment. We used to be kind of like software, entertainment, not really sure which. It's entertainment, I would say now, with a heavy software component. It's a huge mass market phenomenon. It's stuff you see every day on the news. There's a games section in Rolling Stone. We affect major companies' bottom lines. I mean, the idea that Halo or Kinect affect Microsoft's bottom line, to me, boggles my mind. If you compare that to, I mean, admittedly, George Lucas is a big, famous guy, and he's got a big, famous company, but there's 50 of us, and we're tinkering on these little things. The idea that that would come to where we are now today is just amazing to me. The cloud now offers direct access to just about everything in the whole universe, quite a contrast to the old CD-ROM. Audio hardware is now a tiny version of home theater. What you can do on an iPhone with audio blows away anything the most hi-fi game stuff could do in 1991 or so. And wait a minute, space is an issue? Yeah, well, if you're in mobile games, it is. And one thing I will say is space is always going to be an issue. From the floppy disk to wherever, there's always going to be some little thing in our business that is cutting edge and new and is all about getting it onto some even tinier little space than it's been before. Low res, looks like I skipped a little bullet point there, but low res 2.5D are now, 2D and 2.5D are now hip and retro and cool, but so is 3D, of course. So what this means is budgets, they might be small. And this, did anybody see Brian's? You guys were here for Brian Schmidt's talk, right? The broad span of projects in this industry is just amazing now. And so you may have these little tiny projects, little mobile projects, or you may have, these ridiculously big budget projects. We wear slightly fewer hats than we did. Again, this applies more to some of us than to others. Invention means creating your own necessity, because we have access to a lot of cool stuff now. I have a studio that I would have killed for back in those days. And we go lo-fi, not because we have to, but because we can. Because it works for the project, because it's cool. And we're often out of house, and that was an interesting thing in Brian's talk as well. We're often out of house now as opposed to in-house. We get brought in very quickly sometimes on a project, and schedules can be insane. And yes, they were always insane. I'm not sure they were quite this insane. But we still like to innovate. We still want to make the music cool. We still want to do new stuff. So the challenge now is to rise from a sea of content, vast, huge sea of content, to grab people's attention in the mass market and still satisfy a really picky cadre of true believers, right? So what was it like? I think it's worth, when we go back and look and see if we can learn anything from the beginnings of time, as it were. What was it like culturally? Well, it was a lot like college, only more so. When I was hired at Lucas, we used to have parties, basically, where you would try out people would have ideas for games, and they would code them up. And then we'd have this thing called a pizza orgy, where, and this is a real picture of a real pizza orgy. The idea being that if it's not fun at a party, maybe it's not that fun. And so everybody would play the game at these things, and give their feedback. And that was sort of part of the culture there. Fun was a big, huge part of the culture. The tools we had to work with were really rudimentary, okay? They were consumer and hobbyist level tools. Pro Tools 1.0 came out in 1991. It cost $6,000. And guess what? We didn't have it. It was deemed too expensive for the kind of work we were doing. Most of the tools we used were in-house. NIH, everybody knows what that means, right? Not invented here. If you get something from off the shelf, you're not a sufficiently cool cowboy programmer. You need to make it yourself. And part of that was a necessity because we didn't have tools to do the kinds of things we really wanted to do. So the good point about that is you got an intimate connection with the results of what you were doing. It was a very sort of integrated process in terms of creating audio and implementing it and then experiencing it, and I will get to that in a little more detail in a bit. And one of the hats that we wore as composers was the mechanic's hat. We would actually, to use the sports car analogy, we would work on the car, get out and drive it for a while, get out, work on the car, drive it for a while. And that allowed us to create tools that really worked well for us. It also did mean we spent a lot of time creating tools and maybe not quite as much time as we would like to have been writing music. And we do all that, as I said, because it's cool. We're interested in doing something really creative, but also because we have to, because there's no choice. Okay, now I'm going to actually get into an example here of a tool. Our interactive music system was called IMUSE. It stood for Interactive Music and Sound Effects. The term now is adaptive, so sometimes I'm going to say adaptive music and sometimes I'm going to say interactive music. I mean the same thing. And we had a tool that we used for composers called iMac. And sorry about the confusion. This was invented before the iMac was invented. And it was just our tool that we ran on the Macintosh to help us create our music and then actually hear it in a context very much like the game without having to bother the programmers. So what it let you do is create buttons and associate game states with those buttons and then place those buttons on a map so that you could see how all the pieces of music and the states in the game relate to each other. And that was very useful because it was, it was very visual and it was very immediate. You would press a button, trigger audio files with behaviors, which were then entered into an H file. Now, anybody code C in this room? Wow. See, in whatever, 1992, I think probably most of the hands would have gone up. So an H file is just something in the C language. And what that did is it provided a customizable layer of logic between game states and music states. So the programmers would be programming the game. They would simply be setting state codes. We'd be here writing our music. And then also implementing this layer, which is essentially equivalent to WISE or Fmod now, of something that would interpret those game states. And then we'd also be using this tool to visualize what we were doing. We could test the interactivity without doing a build of the game. I would write stuff for Grim Fandango, and then basically minutes later be testing the transitions between various pieces in the game and just seeing kind of how it fit together in the score. And the thing that was cool about this visual thing is for adventure games, which was the type of game we were mostly working on, a mental picture of the universe, of all the places you can go, because you're constantly going from one place to another in an adventure game. That mental picture is really nice to have a visual for. And again, it gave this sort of visceral connection between the composer and the actual audio experience that the listener was ultimately going to have. And I'm going to actually take a little detour here. And we're going to go. How many of you guys are too young to really remember this screen clearly? I wonder. So there's an ancient Mac being emulated in my modern-day laptop here. And here's our little tool. It's called iMac. When you launch it, oh my goodness, look at all those errors. Remember those errors? Don't worry. It's okay. It's okay. It's all right. It's cool. So this is the script that I wrote for year 2 of Grim Fandango. And what you would do is you would, I think it's under this menu. Nope. There it is. You could create a button simply by, let's try a new sequence. No, it doesn't like that right now. Anyway, you would create a button. You would enter a little code into it. Then the button would appear on here. You could draw these lines so that you just, so as a mnemonic device to yourself, you could remember what rooms connect to which other rooms. And then you could play a piece and then play another piece and then listen to the transition actually execute. And when you did this, this corresponded to stuff. Do I want to do it in an H file, right? And this is where we would enter all the data just by hand. It really wasn't very hard. You basically listed all the pieces of music and then transition types, and there were a bunch of codes that gave information about how the transition was supposed to behave between different pieces of music. Is that a we're almost, 5 minutes. Holy crap. Okay, anyway. So very quickly, right now this sounds like this, which isn't very good. Oh, I don't hear anything. Oh, well. Oh, yeah. Yeah, sorry, that's a bug. It works on a G4, but it doesn't work on my emulator. But you get the idea of what this was. And what it really allowed you to do was to just, experience essentially what you were doing without having to code up the game. It was a great tool, and I wish we had more stuff like it now. So let me go back into let's go to here. So takeaways. 5 minutes of takeaways coming up here. First, there's stuff to throw out, okay? No, not that. Or that. That's the real orchestra version, by the way. I think in some ways it's a nice thing that we don't have to wear as many hats as we used to. I think those of us who are working on really, cutting-edge small projects can appreciate, though, that it was cool to wear a lot of hats. So just beware of how many hats you're wearing, and don't wear more than you have to, but don't wear too few either, really. Yeah, see, that's guys wearing too many. Unnecessary tweakery. We were given this mandate to do cool stuff, and without a clear fear of the bottom line, there was definitely a certain amount of self-indulgence that went on, which we could have done without. Penny wise and pound foolish. Sometimes when you're doing a small project, when you're doing something by your bootstraps, you will economize in places where you should not. I really wish we had bought those Pro Tools systems, okay? Would have been nice. We had to wait till Grim Fandango to get them, I think, if I remember right. But good takeaways, right? The spirit of invention, I think, is something that can sometimes be lost when you have a lot of resources. And one thing that I think I'd like to sort of try to get across is this idea of, well, if necessity is the mother of invention, but you don't have a lot of necessity in the sense that you have a lot of great resources and you have a lot of possibilities of what you can do, what do you do with that? Well, one really interesting thing is to essentially create your own necessity. Make your own self-limiting decisions that focus your statement, okay? So Frank Zappa, every year, he used to send flowers to Edgar Varese. Now, I don't know if you guys know who Edgar Varese was, But he wrote all of 14 pieces in his entire life, and yet somehow by writing just 14 pieces, he had more impact than most composers of the 20th century. He was an amazing composer. Igor Stravinsky, at a time when people were getting totally complex and wrote, and writing atonal music, Igor Stravinsky decided to write a symphony in C. What a great idea. A lot of time he used to just simply restrict himself by note choice. And how that translates to us today, I think, the idea of sort of self-imposed necessity or self-limitation, is just remembering that high production values don't necessarily make art, right? And in that sense, Laura Shigihara, the original Plants vs. Zombies composer, she's a genius. Choosing amazing, perfect set of sounds, which are not big, but they're small, because the game is not big. It's small, but it's wonderful. That kind of creativity, I think, is something that, you only get once in a while. And it reminds me of that time. And since a lot of us now are working on mobile projects, or we're working on, independent or so-called casual projects, I think that's a great thing to keep in mind. Nothing wrong, by the way, with having big resources. I mean, I do not think there is a wasted note in the Halo score. That is an awesome. I don't want to try to get too like reverse snob here. Finally, there are just sort of cultural things. Like I said, learning to wear the right number of hats. I was glad I did the programming. I was glad I did the music. I really did prefer to do the music in the end, and I was glad to be able to finally get the one part of things to the point where I could do the other more. So it's great that we don't have to do, I'm being cut off. Be in-house even when you're out-house. Pretend like you are part of the team even when you are working outside of the house. Because more of us are out of house now than used to be. Not in the outhouse, as Brian said, but out of house. And finally, make it fun. It's all about, I really, really look back fondly on the spirit that we had in those days of just fun. And I think there's a lot of that still today, and it's something we never want to lose. And I'll take questions if we have time. If anybody has a question, they could probably come up to the mic. That would be the best way to do it.
We actually have a 30-minute break after.
Oh, okay.
So we can take about 5-10 minutes of questions, then people still 20 minutes break.
Cool. Oh, okay. So I didn't have to race like that? Oh, okay. Well, I had some very profound things that I went through very quickly. Yes.
What do you make of the whole retro revival that sort of has been happening, where a lot of these music for games are starting to sound more like 8-bit? Do you think something was lost in the high production values? Why do you think that's happening? Is there? Well,
it sort of goes to my point there about what do you do in this time when you can do whatever you want, right? And I think it can be great and it can be annoying. And the thing is to try to, the question is it done with the right spirit? Is it done with a respect for the original sound or the original intent, which may be, like, for instance, Grim Fandango, right? I was so proud of that game when it came out, but I winced every time I heard the stuff that wasn't live, okay? We did not have a budget for that. I am not nostalgic for the fact that we did not have a budget to do an orchestra for Grimm. There is nothing great about that. And one of the best gifts to me as an artist was to be able to redo that with a live orchestra. And, of course, we try not to get into colorizing film, as it were, right? We don't want to ruin the original feeling. But we want to be able to do what we wanted to do. So does that answer your question?
Sort of.
Sort of. It's like, what about that? You're talking about like the chiptune thing,
Well, I'm talking about projects kind of like Fez, where it's like it's trying to bring back, I guess, a lot of the stuff that was good about it. I mean, the self-imposed limitations.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's like we have to self-impose them, whereas before, you know, so I guess I was just wondering your take on it because, yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
I think retro stuff is awesome, and I'm first of all, I'm grateful for the attention to stuff of that time because I think, you know, we have one of the things, you know, Tommy Tallarico, Video Games Live. One of the things he does so wonderfully is he reminds us that we have a culture, that we have a history, that we have literature now, a body of work. And part of that body of work is, you know, the original Mario theme. And part of that body of work is God of War. And I think that if you're asking, well, is it kind of gimmicky to do? And yes, sometimes it is kind of gimmicky, but it can be done right so that it's like, hey, check this out. This is like this is part of our canon. You know, I think that's cool.
Cool, thank you.
Hi, just out of curiosity, there's a tool called Max MSP, and I was curious if you found that as a suitable substitute for setting up and kind of putting together the room ideas.
You did notice that resembled Max a little bit, yes. Yeah. Max was too geeky for us. We found it did a lot of things that we weren't very interested in. I've done performances with Max, and I have a lot of respect for that whole earcom, you know, tinkering with electronic music. It was a little less grounded in the type of things that we wanted to do, though. What we wanted to do was basically imitate a pit orchestra. There's a performance on stage. There's a conductor. He's watching the performance, and he's like conducting. He's like, measure 32 now, right? And that's what we wanted to have. And that's not Max. Okay. That's IMUSE.
Cool.
And FMOD and WISE and a lot of the tools that we have now, and Exact. And I mean, it's you know, there's been a lot of stuff coming down the pike since then.
Definitely. Thank you.
You talked a lot about programs where you had to program them yourself, like
yes.
iMac. Is there still value in doing that, or would you rather be leaning on Pro Tools and those modern programs of today?
I think there is actually still value in doing that. It depends on what you think you're going to get out of it, right? Now, I mean, specifically, well, do you mean like the thing I showed you?
Yeah.
How I'd like to see that happen today is I'd like to see WISE allow you to create buttons and not have to deal with object-oriented programming when you're trying to write music.
Okay.
Sorry, guys.
Thank you.
And you know, that's one thing that we were very big on was not only getting under the hood and making it cool inside, but also having respect for the fact that when you're trying to write music at 3 in the morning and it has to be done tomorrow and you want to do something cool, the last thing you want to do is get out of your right brain, that's the creative one, right, supposedly, and go to that other brain and start writing C code. So we wrote C code, but it wasn't very much. Anyway, yeah.
Hi. What new games are you playing, and who do you feel like is pushing the genre of adventure games?
Well, I'm kind of biased on that one. You know, I think Tim Schafer is the most amazing game designer who ever drew breath. So that's just and I have worked for him for many, many years. So I think that's, you know, so it's hard for me to. Sorry.
Thank you.
Hi there. You brought up Super Mario, went back to like the old school music, and that got me thinking about how it seems like there's a recent phenomenon, like a certain philosophy of game writers where you have to avoid the repetitive. Like you have to make sure that if they're going to be stuck in the same spot for like 5 minutes, then you can't have anything that's too repetitive or anthemic. Otherwise, it just gets grating. But then for the same token, you also look back on these older games for like the Nintendo, like the Super Marios and the Zeldas and the Pokemons and all that. Like what really makes those is the sort of is that very anthemic sort of music that goes along with it. So I'm wondering, like, is that style of like very anthemic, melody-driven music in game, like, is that really just sort of like fading out at this point, or is that really just some small sector that think it is?
Oh no, I don't think so at all. I think a lot of people are doing melodic, anthemic stuff. I mean, yes, there's I mean, there's just so much variety now. There are situations for which it just isn't appropriate. You know, something that's more atmospheric or dark or action-oriented. There are parts where you don't want to be, a melody would be distracting, right? Mm-hmm. And then there are other parts of the same kind of game that need to be very, you know, righteous and thematic. And so no, I don't really subscribe to, oh, those were the good old days. You know, you take a guy like Frankie, when you have lived and loved like Frankie has, now that guy could sing a tune, right? Mm-hmm. There is sort of that feeling maybe about the old game music. And it's true, when you only have a sound blaster to come out of, and it's got to sound good on an ad-lib, the tune had better be good. Mm-hmm. That's absolutely true. But that doesn't mean the tune can't be good now. And part of the challenge of, you know, this sort of wealth of opportunity that we have is to kind of keep that simplicity in mind. And that's sort of where we get back to the idea of imposing your own restrictions.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you.
All set? All right.